Wyoming Territory. Early spring of 1883, the wind carried dust and the scent of thawing earth through the ghost-quiet town of Larkspur Hollow. Amelia Lark sat alone on the creaking porch of her late father's ranch house, hands resting in her lap, empty as the house behind her. The rocking chair barely moved. She stared at the distant hills, where snow still clung to the ridges, and her breath came slow and even, like someone too tired to cry anymore. Her black skirts hung heavy around her ankles, and her boots were coated in dried mud from the walk back from the train station. No one had met her there. She had come back to nothing. The ranch was barely holding together. The barn door leaned off one hinge, and the corral fence had fallen in two places. The livestock were gone, long sold or taken. Her father's passing 6 months prior had left her with debts and silence. Her mother had died years ago. And her brother, Everett, had abandoned the land and her right after the funeral, chasing money north in Montana and never writing back. Amelia had been 25 when she left Wyoming to work as a governess in Kansas. Now she was 28, tired and alone. She had come back because it was all she had left. The screen door creaked open behind her, and a small voice broke the stillness. "Are we going to stay here?" Amelia turned her head and looked at the boy standing just inside the doorway. Elijah, her sister's son, had been in her care for 2 months ever since her sister died in childbirth, and the baby girl lasted only 2 days. Elijah was just 6, too thin, with dark, watchful eyes that carried too much sorrow. He clutched his small satchel like it was a lifeline. "Yes," Amelia said softly. "We are." He nodded, saying nothing, and closed the door again. She heard his small feet padding back toward the front room. She looked back out at the prairie. The wind picked up and her hands clenched tighter in her lap. She had no livestock, no money, barely a roof. And a child who needed more than she knew how to give. The sound of hooves broke the quiet, slow and steady. She stood. A horse came into view from the north road, and the man riding it straightened when he saw her. He dismounted before the gate, tying the reins to the post. He was tall, lean, and sun-browned. His dusty blue shirt was rolled at the sleeves, and his brown hair curled slightly at his collar. He carried a bunch of wild prairie flowers in one hand, and in the other, a small velvet ring box. Her breath caught. "Amelia," he called gently, walking toward the porch. She blinked, her throat tightening. "Paxton Graves," he smiled, slow and unsure. "Been a long time." 10 years, she whispered. He stopped at the edge of the porch steps. The flowers in his hand trembled just slightly. "I heard you came back. Saw Elijah at the mercantile yesterday. Thought I'd come see if you needed a hand." She looked at the flowers, then the box. He followed her gaze, then looked sheepish. "I know it is sudden, but I have carried this ring a long time. Since the summer you left Larkspur Hollow. I wanted to give it to you then, but I waited too long." Her voice broke. "You kept it," he gave a slight nod. "Always figured I would know when it was time." She sank slowly back into the chair. Her hands opened again, resting palm up in her lap. He stepped up onto the porch. "I do not expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know. I never stopped thinking about you." "Why now?" she asked, voice hoarse. He knelt in front of her, setting the flowers carefully on her lap. His hands were rough, warm, as he opened the small box. Inside was a simple silver ring, polished by time and touch, with a small turquoise stone set in the middle. "Because I figured you might need someone to believe in you, and because I love you." Her breath hitched. He was still looking up at her, steady and sure. "I have a small herd, a good piece of land out near the river. We can fix this place up or start fresh. I can help care for Elijah. I want to." "You would do all that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would do more if it meant I could be by your side." She looked down at the flowers. They were picked fresh prairie crocus, tiny bluebells, and a sprig of sage. Her hands moved slowly, wrapping around the stems. She looked back at him. His eyes were steady. No lies, no charm, just truth. She touched the ring with trembling fingers. "I do not have anything to give you." Paxton smiled, soft and full. "You are everything." She let out a shaky breath. "Yes," his brows lifted. "Yes, yes," she said again, stronger this time. He stood, took her hand, and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The screen door opened again, and Elijah peeked out, eyes wide. Paxton turned, then knelt. "Hello there." Elijah looked at Amelia, unsure. She smiled through tears. "This is Paxton. He is going to help us." Elijah stepped out slowly, then reached for the flowers in Amelia's lap. "Are those for us?" Paxton nodded. "They are." Elijah looked up at him. "Okay." Then he sat on the porch beside Amelia, leaning against her arm. Paxton sat on her other side, close but not crowding, his hand brushing hers. For the first time in a long while, the porch didn't feel so empty, and neither did her hands. The next morning brought a pale sun that warmed the frost off the barn's sagging roof. A meadowlark called from the cottonwood behind the house, its song thin in the wind. Amelia stood by the kitchen table, rolling up the sleeves of her faded blouse. The stove was lit, but the room still held the edge of night's chill. Elijah sat on a stool near her, tracing circles in the flour dust across the tabletop. "You ever milk a cow before?" Paxton's voice came from the doorway, low and easy. Amelia turned. He carried a bucket in one hand and a folded rag draped over his shoulder. His boots were streaked with old manure and his trousers were damp at the hem. "I've watched it done," she said. "Never had much reason to try myself." "Well," he said, setting the bucket down, "that red Jersey Outback's been loaned to me by my neighbor, Mr. Fitch. She's gentle but particular. Won't give more than a trickle if you come at her wrong." Elijah looked up. "Can I try?" Paxton crouched beside him. "You can, but she'll need to get used to you first. Animals know when you're nervous." "I'm not nervous," the boy said, though his voice betrayed him. Paxton's eyes held a quiet patience. "Then we'll start slow." Amelia wiped her hands on her apron. "You came early." "I never sleep much," he said. "Too many years of waking with the sun." She watched him for a moment. The morning light softened the roughness in his face, revealing something unguarded. A gentleness that hadn't been there in the boy he once was. She motioned toward the door. "Show me what she needs." They walked together to the small lean-to near the barn, where the cow stood tethered, her large eyes blinking slow. The air smelled of hay and earth. Paxton moved with practiced ease, setting the bucket below and settling onto the low stool. "She's been milked by the same hand for a while," he said. "Takes time to earn trust again." Amelia knelt beside him, skirts tucked under. "Is that true of people too?" He glanced at her. "Sometimes, but not always." She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing the cow's side. The animal shifted but didn't pull away. "You're steady," he said. "I try to be." He leaned back, letting her take the stool. "Try your hand. Gentle pressure, not too quick." She did as he said, fumbling at first, then settling into a rhythm. The milk hit the pail with soft splashes. Elijah stood just outside the open stall, watching without a word. Paxton crouched beside him. "You see how she doesn't rush? That's the trick." Elijah nodded, eyes wide. When the pail was nearly full, Amelia stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's harder than it looks." "You did fine," Paxton said. "Better than most first tries." They walked back toward the house, Elijah running ahead with a stick in hand, jabbing at patches of snow that still lingered in the shade. Amelia glanced sideways at Paxton. "Why'd you come back to Larkspur Hollow? Thought you'd headed west with your brother." "I did," he said. Ran cattle in Utah for a while, broke horses in Nevada, but it never fit right. Why not? He looked down at the path. Too much noise, too many men chasing something they couldn't name. I figured I'd rather build something slow and true than keep moving just to keep from feeling alone. They reached the porch. Elijah had already dropped his stick and was poking at the moss growing along the steps. Amelia turned to Paxton. "You mean to stay then, if you'll have me," he said. She stepped inside without answering but left the door open behind her. He followed. Later, while Elijah napped curled in a quilt by the stove, Amelia stood by the window, watching the wind tug at the prairie grass. Paxton joined her there, saying nothing. "I don't know how to let someone help me," she said quietly. "I've spent too long depending on no one." "I don't want to take anything from you," he said. "Only give what I can." She turned to him. "What if I don't know what that is yet?" He met her eyes. "Then we find out together." Neither moved for a long moment. Outside, the breeze shifted, carrying the scent of warming soil and the promise of spring that hadn't quite settled yet. She reached out, brushing her fingers across his wrist, just once before letting her hand fall back. He didn't speak, just stood beside her until the light thinned on the horizon and Elijah stirred in the next room, asking for his aunt. By the following week, the smell of sawdust had replaced the mildew in the back room. Paxton had cleared out the broken bed frame and patched the leaking roof above it. He moved with quiet purpose around the house and land, never needing direction, never asking for thanks. Amelia watched him from the kitchen window as he hoisted fence rails into place. Sleeves rolled past his elbows, his shirt damp with effort. Elijah sat cross-legged nearby, carving lines into the dirt with a twig, glancing up every so often to mimic Paxton's movements with exaggerated gestures. Inside, Amelia stitched patches over the thin spots in Elijah's only good coat. Her needle moved steadily, but her mind wandered. She had not worn the ring to bed, setting it beside the oil lamp each night like it was something fragile. Morning after morning, she'd put it back on with care, the stone warming slowly against her skin. That afternoon, Paxton walked in with a parcel wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table and unwrapped it to reveal a pair of old leather-bound books and a tin of lye soap. "I traded a few pelts with the circuit preacher," he said, brushing the dust off the covers. "Figured Elijah might need something to read once the chores are done." "He only just began his letters," Amelia said, her eyes softening at the gesture. "Well, then he'll have something to grow into." She turned the top book over in her hands. The spine was cracked, the pages brittle with aged sermons and parables from a Methodist press out of Boston. She couldn't recall the last time someone had brought her something she hadn't asked for. Something thoughtful. Paxton leaned against the edge of the counter, arms folded. "You used to read to the schoolchildren out by the church. I remember your voice carrying down the slope. I didn't think anyone noticed." "I did," he said. "You always read like the words mattered." She set the book down slowly. "They did, I just forgot how much." He picked up the tin of soap. "This is for you. Smells of lavender, closest to a luxury I could find." "Lavender?" she asked, brows raised. "Didn't peg you for the scenting type." He chuckled low. "I'm not, but the woman at the mercantile said it helps with sleep." Amelia took the tin, her thumb brushing the edge. "You think I need help sleeping? I think anyone carrying as much as you do might appreciate a little peace at the end of the day." She looked at him then, something unguarded passing between them. The air was still, the wind outside having quieted to a hush. "You always say just enough," she said. He tipped his head. "Spent too many years around men who talked too much and said nothing real." That evening they sat on the porch again, Elijah between them with his knees pulled to his chest. The boy pointed at the stars above. naming the few shapes he'd learned: a crooked horse, a cooking pot, a bear that looked nothing like one. Paxton leaned back against the rail, his gaze on the sky. "My ma used to say you can measure a man by the way he looks at the stars." Amelia tilted her head. "And how's that? If he looks up and thinks of what he wants to take, he'll never be satisfied. But if he looks up and feels small in the best way, he's worth trusting." She let the silence settle between them. "Did you feel that way?" she asked. He turned his eyes to hers. "I do now." Elijah yawned and leaned against her side. She gathered him into her lap without thinking, wrapping her arms around him. He was warm and still, his breathing slow. When Paxton stood to leave, he paused near the steps. "I'll be back before sunup. I've got a friend bringing over a few hens. Figured you could use the eggs." Amelia nodded but didn't rise. "You always know what's needed," he smiled faintly. "That's what love is for." She didn't speak, but her eyes followed him all the way down the path until the dark folded him in. When she finally rose to carry Elijah to bed, the ring on her finger gleamed in the lantern light, no longer just a promise, but something already beginning to take root. The hens arrived with the sun low enough to throw long shadows across the yard. Paxton led them from the cart with a gentle tug on the rope, and Elijah stood barefoot in the patchy grass, arms folded like a foreman overseeing a delivery. Amelia, washing the last of the dinner plates in the tin basin, watched through the open window as the birds clucked and flapped into their new enclosure. "They'll lay fine once they get settled," Paxton said, brushing his hands against his trousers. Elijah crouched to inspect a speckled one. "This one's got a crooked toe." "They're tougher than they look," Paxton replied, his tone light. "Crooked toe or not, she'll do her part." Amelia dried her hands on the cloth tied at her waist before stepping outside. The air had warmed just enough to carry the scent of tilled earth from the fields beyond the ridge, where the snow had finally receded. "You always this generous with your animals?" she asked. "I figure if I treat them decent, they might return the favor." She leaned against the fence rail, her eyes following a hen pecking near Elijah's feet. "I don't know what you're expecting from all this." "I'm not expecting," he said, brushing a loose curl from his forehead. "I'm offering." His voice held no weight of demand, only a quiet steadiness that settled under her ribs. Later, after the chickens had quieted and Elijah had fallen asleep with a wooden whistle, Paxton carved that afternoon still clutched in his hand. They sat again on the porch. The wind had died entirely. The prairie was still, holding its breath beneath the stars. "I haven't told you why I left Kansas," Amelia said. Paxton didn't turn to look at her. He waited. "I was living in a house that wasn't mine, raising children that weren't mine, answering to a man who thought kindness was weakness. I stayed too long." "What made you leave in the end?" She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "One of the boys I cared for, he fell sick. His father didn't want a doctor, said it was a waste. I went behind his back, got the boy help, he lived. I lost my place." Paxton's hands rested on his knees. "You'd do it again?" "I would, but I'd do it sooner." He nodded once. "I'm glad you came back." She looked at him then, the porch lamp throwing gold across his jaw. "I didn't expect to find anything waiting here." "You didn't," he said. "You're building it." The quiet stretched between them. Then Amelia rose and stepped inside. When she returned, she held something wrapped in a cloth napkin. She handed it to him without a word. He unfolded the cloth and found a loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. "I know the flour came from your stores," she said. "Figured you deserved something back." He broke off a piece and handed it to her. "Then we'll share it." They ate in silence, the crust crackling between their fingers. When the last of the bread was gone, Paxton stood. "I'll bring a plow next week." That southern patch's got good soil if you work it right. She nodded. I'll be ready. He stepped down the porch, then paused. I never asked what kind of wedding you want. Amelia looked out over the land where the moonlight turned the fields silver. Something plain, honest. Just enough to hold together. He smiled gently. That's the only kind I ever wanted. Then he tipped his hat and walked into the dark. Amelia stood there long after he was gone, her fingers resting over the stone on her ring. It wasn't just a promise anymore. It was a beginning. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was waiting for loss. She was waiting for morning. The wedding took place in the back pasture 2 weeks later, where the grass had greened under the last of the spring melt, and a few wild violets had crept up along the fence posts. There weren't many guests, just Paxton's friend Jonah, who'd brought the hens, and Mrs. Albright from the mercantile, who insisted on sewing a ribbon into Amelia's hair. Elijah stood between them, his shirt tucked in neat, a sprig of sage pinned above his heart. The preacher from the next town over rode in on a borrowed mule, his collar askew and Bible pages fluttering in the breeze. He read from a passage about shelter and steadfastness, his voice low and solemn. Paxton held Amelia's hands in his thumbs tracing once over her knuckles before going still. Her dress was simple, a soft blue calico she hadn't worn since Kansas, altered with careful stitches the night before. "I'll stand with you," Paxton said, voice steady. "Through every lean year and every full one." She didn't glance away. "And I with you." When the preacher told him to kiss his bride, Paxton leaned in slow, brushing his lips over hers with a reverence that felt like a promise made flesh. Elijah clapped, cheeks flushed and Mrs. Albright wiped at her eyes, muttering something about wind getting in them. They shared bread and dried apples afterward, seated on a quilt spread over the grass. Jonah played a tune on his mouth harp, the notes faint and sweet like memory. Paxton kept one arm around Amelia's waist, fingers curled at her side like he was still making sure she was real. That night, after Elijah had fallen asleep curled in the crook of a pallet near the hearth, Amelia and Paxton stood in the doorway, watching the sky shift from blue to indigo. "I had a dream once," she said, voice quiet. "I was standing in a field like this, holding someone's hand. I didn't know who it was then." He reached for her fingers. "You do now." She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. The beat of his heart was slow and sure beneath her cheek. They moved back into the room where the roof no longer leaked and the window opened without sticking. Paxton had carved a bed frame from pine, smoothing every edge. The mattress was stuffed with fresh straw, and Amelia had stitched a quilt from old shirts and unused calico. When they lay down together, neither spoke. The silence between them was full, not empty. In the weeks that followed, the southern patch turned dark with new growth. Elijah learned to gather eggs without dropping them. The hens settled into their rhythm. Paxton built a smokehouse behind the shed, and Amelia planted dill and yarrow along the fence for drying. They didn't speak often of the past, but it lived quietly between them, respected but not fed. One morning, as they walked the field's edge, Amelia paused by the cottonwood where meadowlarks nested. "I used to think this land had forgotten me," she said. Paxton knelt to pull a weed from between the rows. "Maybe it was just waiting." She crouched beside him, brushing soil from her hands. "You think things can start over?" "No," he said. "I think they grow from where they're planted." She turned to him. "Then we'll make sure it's good ground." They kissed there, with the wind brushing through the new stalks and the sun warm on their backs. Her hands found his, dirt and all, and held tight. Years passed, as years always do. The house stood stronger each season. Elijah grew taller, his boots clomping louder, his smile easier. He built a tree swing from Paxton's rope and spent his summers reading aloud under the branches. Amelia taught at the small church school when the circuit teacher fell ill, and Paxton took over as caretaker of the church grounds, fixing pews and mending fences. On their third spring together, Paxton built a porch swing. They sat there most evenings, watching the stars come on one by one. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't need to. One evening, as the wind pushed warm air across the grass and the hens tucked in for the night, Paxton rested his hand over hers and said, "You made this place home." Amelia looked out over the land, then back at him. "We did." And when he kissed her, slow and certain, the prairie held still around them like it was listening.